At 2:17 a.m. on November 13, 1942, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Fletcher, a brand-new destroyer steaming at 32 knots, through Iron-Bottom Sound off Guadalcanal, watching the muzzle flashes of Japanese cruisers 8,000 yards ahead. His destroyer squadron had been patrolling the waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal when radar picked up the Japanese force. 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers heading south toward the American landing beaches. Evans' orders were to intercept and attack. The 4 American destroyers were outgunned. The Japanese cruisers each carried 10 8-inch guns. The destroyers had 5 5-inch guns each. But the destroyers had torpedoes, 10 Mark 15 torpedoes per ship, mounted in 2 quintuple launchers amidships. The Mark 15 was a formidable weapon, 21 feet long, 3,000 pounds, carried a 825-pound warhead. Range, 15,000 yards at 45 knots. A single hit could cripple a cruiser. 2 hits could sink one. Evans planned a standard torpedo attack, close to 5,000 yards, turn broadside to present the torpedo tubes, launch a full spread, then turn away and retreat at high speed. The problem was the Japanese had seen this attack pattern before. They'd fought American destroyers in 6 major night actions since August. They knew American torpedo tactics, knew to watch for the turn. When a destroyer turned broadside, it was launching torpedoes. The Japanese would illuminate the destroyer with searchlights, concentrate fire, sink it before it could complete the launch. The Americans had lost 4 destroyers this way. Evans had watched one burn and sink during the Battle of Cape Esperance in October. The destroyer had turned broadside at 4,500 yards. Japanese searchlights caught it immediately. 8-inch shells tore it apart in 90 seconds. The destroyer never launched its torpedoes. Evans needed a different approach, something the Japanese wouldn't expect. He'd been thinking about this problem for weeks, studying torpedo mechanics, attack geometry, Japanese responses. He'd realized something that contradicted doctrine. Destroyers didn't have to turn broadside to launch torpedoes. The torpedo tubes could rotate. They had 150 degrees of traverse. They could point almost directly aft, which meant a destroyer could launch torpedoes while retreating. While running away at full speed, the maneuver would look like a retreat. The Japanese would pursue, confident they were chasing a fleeing destroyer. Then the destroyer would launch torpedoes backward into the pursuing ships. The Japanese wouldn't see it coming. No turn, no exposure, no warning. Just torpedoes appearing in the water ahead of them while they chased what they thought was a fleeing target. Evans had proposed the maneuver to his squadron commander 2 weeks earlier. The commander was skeptical. Retreating while launching torpedoes violated doctrine. It looked like cowardice. What if other ships thought you were running away, Evans argued. That perception was the advantage. Make the enemy think you're retreating. Let them chase you into your torpedoes. The commander finally agreed to let Evans try it if the opportunity arose. Now, watching Japanese cruisers bearing down on his squadron, Evans decided the opportunity had arrived. He ordered his destroyer to charge directly at the Japanese formation. Maximum speed. The other 3 destroyers followed. They raced toward WWII, the cruisers. The range closed rapidly, 8,000 yards, 7,000, 6,000, the Japanese opened fire. Shells splashed around the destroyers. Then Evans gave the order that changed American destroyer tactics. All ships turn away, full speed retreat. Rotate torpedo tubes aft, prepare to fire on my command. The 4 destroyers turned simultaneously, reversed course, started running away from the Japanese at 35 knots. To the Japanese commanders, it looked like the American destroyers had lost their nerve. Charged to 6,000 yards, then turned and ran. The Japanese increased speed, began pursuit. They were confident. American destroyers always retreated. After firing torpedoes, these destroyers were retreating before firing. Must have panicked. This would be an easy kill. What the Japanese didn't see was that the American torpedo tubes were rotating, turning aft, pointing backward toward the pursuing cruisers. At 2:19 a.m., with the range down to 5,500 yards, Evans gave the order. Fire all torpedoes, 40 marker, 15 torpedoes launched from 4 destroyers, all fired backward, all aimed at the pursuing Japanese cruisers. The torpedoes entered the water at 45 knots, running hot and straight. The destroyers continued retreating. The Japanese continued pursuing. They didn't know torpedoes were in the water, didn't see the launches. No destroyer had turned broadside, no classic attack profile. The Japanese lookouts were watching for the turn. That would signal torpedo launch, but the turn never came. 90 seconds later, the first torpedo hit the lead cruiser, then 3 more in rapid succession. The cruiser's bow disintegrated. She slewed to port, slowing. The second cruiser tried to evade, but 2 torpedoes caught her amidships. Both cruisers were crippled. 4 destroyers rushed to their aid. 1 destroyer took a torpedo meant for the cruisers. Broke in half, the Japanese formation dissolved into chaos. Ships maneuvering wildly, trying to avoid torpedoes they hadn't seen launched. Evans' destroyers escaped into the darkness. The backward torpedo attack had worked perfectly. What started as an improvised tactic would revolutionize American destroyer warfare. In the Pacific, Ernest Evans was 34 years old, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, part Cherokee descent. His family had no naval tradition. His father was a railroad worker. His mother was a schoolteacher. Evans was the first in his family to attend college. He received an appointment to the Naval Academy in 1927, graduated in 1931, served on battleships and cruisers before the war. He was assigned to destroyers in 1941, loved the smaller ships, loved the speed, the maneuverability, the independence. Destroyers fought differently than battleships. They relied on speed and surprise, rather than armor and firepower. Evans understood that destroyer combat required thinking differently. The Fletcher-class destroyer was the most advanced destroyer the U.S. Navy had built. 376 feet long, 250 tons displacement, 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 21-inch torpedo, tubes in 2 quintuple mounts. Top speed 38 knots, the torpedo mounts were positioned amidships, 1 on each side. They could traverse 150 degrees. Standard doctrine called for firing torpedoes on the beam perpendicular to the ship's heading. This maximized the spread pattern and gave torpedoes the best angle to hit enemy ships, but firing on the beam required the destroyer to turn broadside. That exposed the entire length of the ship to enemy fire. A destroyer broadside presented a huge target, easy to hit, easy to sink. Evans had studied the problem extensively, read after action reports from every destroyer engagement since the war started. Noticed a pattern. Destroyers that survived turned away quickly after firing torpedoes. Those that lingered broadside got hit. The exposure time was critical. Less than 30 seconds broadside, good survival rate. More than 60 seconds, high casualty rate. Evans realized that eliminating the broadside turn would eliminate the exposure. If you never turned broadside, the enemy never had a large target. But how do you fire torpedoes without turning? He studied the torpedo mount specifications. The Mark 14 torpedo director allowed the tubes to train 75 degrees forward of the beam, or 75 degrees aft of the beam. That meant they could point almost directly backward, almost directly at a ship chasing you. Evans did the math. A destroyer retreating at 35 knots with a pursuer at 30 knots. Relative closing speed, 5 knots. A torpedo launched backward at 45 knots. Net speed toward pursuer, 40 knots. The geometry worked. The torpedo would close with the pursuing ship faster than the destroyer was opening the range. Evans tested the theory during training exercises in San Diego in September 1942. Set up a mock attack against a friendly cruiser. Charged toward the cruiser, then turned and retreated. Rotated the torpedo tubes aft. Simulated a launch. The exercise observers were confused, asked Evans what he was doing. He explained the backward torpedo concept. They were skeptical, but admitted the geometry worked. The cruiser playing the enemy never saw the simulated launch, thought the destroyer was just retreating. Evans practiced the maneuver repeatedly, refined the timing, found the optimal range for launch. Too close and the torpedoes wouldn't have time to arm. Too far and the enemy might see them and evade. The sweet spot was 5,000 to 6,000 yards. Close enough for high hit probability, far enough for torpedo arming distance. The Fletcher arrived at Guadalcanal in November 1942. Evans took command 2 weeks before the night action, he briefed his crew on the backward torpedo tactic. Most were enthusiastic, a few were nervous. One officer asked if retreating while firing would look like cowardice. Evans said it would look like exactly what it was, a tactical withdrawal that baited the enemy into chasing torpedoes. The officer asked what if the Japanese didn't pursue. Evans said, then we'd have retreated successfully and lived to fight another day. Either way, we survive. The night of November 13th was dark, new, moon-heavy cloud cover, visibility less than 2,000 yards, perfect conditions for the backward torpedo attack. The Japanese wouldn't see the torpedoes in the water until too late. Evans' destroyer squadron consisted of 4 ships, Fletcher, O'Bannon, Radford, and Nicholas, all Fletcher class, all equipped with the same torpedo systems. Evans briefed the other 3 captains on the tactic before the patrol, explained the maneuver, the timing, the geometry. 2 captains agreed immediately. The third was hesitant but willing to follow Evans' lead. At 1:48 a.m., radar picked up the Japanese formation, 2 large contacts and 6 smaller contacts, cruisers and destroyers, range 15,000 yards, heading south at 20 knots. The squadron increased speed to intercept. By 2:10 a.m., the range was 8,000 yards. The Japanese had spotted the American destroyers on radar. Both forces maneuvered for advantage. The Japanese wanted to bring their superior firepower to bear. The Americans wanted to get within torpedo range without being destroyed. Evans ordered the charge at 2:15 a.m. 4 destroyers accelerated to 35 knots, headed directly at the Japanese cruisers. This was aggressive, potentially suicidal. The Japanese opened fire at 7,000 yards. 8-inch shells from the cruiser's main batteries, searchlights, swept the water, trying to illuminate targets. The destroyers returned, fire with their 5-inch guns, more for distraction than damage. Their real weapon was torpedoes. At 6,000 yards, Evans gave the order to turn away. The 4 destroyers turned in unison. Reversed course started, retreating at maximum speed. The Japanese saw the turn, interpreted it as panic. American destroyers breaking off the attack. The Japanese captains ordered pursuit. This was their chance to catch fleeing destroyers, sink them before they escaped. The cruisers increased to 28 knots. The Japanese destroyers increased to 32 knots, racing ahead to cut off the Americans. What the Japanese didn't see was the torpedo tube rotation. In the darkness, the tubes rotating aft were invisible. The destroyers appeared to be simply fleeing. Evans watched his fire control solution. Range 5,800 yards, target bearing steady, speed differential calculated. The firing solution was perfect. At 2:19 a.m. he gave the order, all ships fire. Torpedoes! The Fletcher's torpedo officer pressed the firing key. 5 torpedoes launched from each mount, 10 torpedoes total. All fired backward, all aimed at the pursuing cruisers. The other 3 destroyers launched simultaneously. 40 torpedoes in the water in 12 seconds. The destroyers continued retreating, maintained course, and speed gave no indication they'd fired. To the Japanese, nothing had changed. The Americans were still running. The cruisers were still pursuing. The torpedoes ran hot and straight at 45 knots. Travel time to target 90 seconds. The Japanese lookouts were watching the fleeing destroyers, not the water ahead. Standard procedure was to watch for torpedo wakes after an enemy destroyer turned broadside. These destroyers hadn't turned broadside, so no one was watching. 4 torpedoes. The first torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Kinugasa at 2:20 a.m., hit forward of the bridge. The 825-pound warhead detonated, blowing a 30-foot hole in the hull. The cruiser's bow twisted to port. Before damage control could respond, 3 more torpedoes hit, 1 amidships, 1 aft. The cruiser shuddered, lost power, began listing. The second, cruiser Chokai, saw Kinugasa explode and ordered emergency turn to starboard. Too late. 2 torpedoes caught her port side. The explosions flooded 2 boiler rooms. Chokai slowed to 12 knots, steering damaged. The Japanese destroyers scattered, trying to evade torpedoes they still couldn't see. One destroyer, Ayanami, turned directly into a torpedo spread. Took a hit amidships that broke her keel. She jackknifed, sank in 4 minutes. The Japanese formation had disintegrated, both cruisers crippled, one destroyer sinking. The remaining destroyers maneuvered frantically. Evans' squadron continued retreating into the darkness. By 2:25 a.m., they were 10,000 yards away, safe. The Japanese didn't pursue, they were too busy, dealing with damaged ships. Kinugasa would sink 4 hours later. Chokai limped back to Rabaul and was under repair for 6 months. The American destroyers had achieved a perfect ambush. 0 casualties, 0 damage. Sank one cruiser, crippled another, sank a destroyer, all by firing torpedoes, backward while retreating. The after-action report reached Admiral William Halsey's headquarters the next morning. Halsey read it twice, called Evans to explain the tactic in detail. Evans described the maneuver, the reasoning, the execution. Halsey asked why no one had thought of this before. Evans said doctrine emphasized offensive attacks. Retreating while fighting violated the aggressive spirit. But sometimes the best offense looked like defense. Make the enemy think you're running, let them chase you into danger. Halsey immediately ordered all destroyer squadrons in the South Pacific to adopt the backward torpedo tactic. Sent out a training directive explaining the maneuver. Required all destroyer captains to practice it. Within 2 weeks, every American destroyer in the theater knew how to fire torpedoes backward. The tactic spread quickly because it worked. Over the next 3 months, American destroyers used backward torpedo attacks in 7 engagements, sank or crippled 11 Japanese ships, lost only 1 destroyer in the process. The Japanese struggled to adapt. Their doctrine assumed American destroyers would attack broadside. That's what they'd always done. The new tactic violated their expectations. Japanese captains who'd learned to watch for the broadside turn now faced destroyers that launched torpedoes while retreating. There was no visual cue, no way to know torpedoes had been launched. By the time they realized torpedoes were in the water, it was too late to evade. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese captains became hesitant to pursue fleeing American destroyers. Every retreat might be a trap, every pursuit might lead into torpedoes. That hesitation changed the tactical dynamic. American destroyers could break off engagements at will. The Japanese wouldn't chase aggressively, couldn't tell if the destroyer was actually retreating or baiting them. On December 1st, 1942, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger used the backward torpedo attack during the Battle of Tassafaronga. His East destroyer squadron intercepted 8 Japanese destroyers running supplies to Guadalcanal. Moosbrugger charged to 7,000 yards, then turned and retreated. The Japanese pursued. Moosbrugger launched 20 torpedoes backward. 4 Japanese destroyers were hit, 2 sank immediately, the other 2 were towed back to Rabaul. Moosbrugger's squadron suffered no losses. The Japanese called it a disaster. Couldn't understand how American torpedoes appeared without warning. In January 1943, the Japanese Navy issued new tactical instructions. Warned captains that American destroyers were using a new attack method, launching torpedoes while retreating, ordered lookouts to watch for torpedo wakes ahead of the ship during pursuit. But the warning came too late. The tactic had already claimed a dozen Japanese ships, and even with the warning, Japanese captains struggled to counter it. If you don't pursue fleeing destroyers, they escape. If you do pursue, you might run into torpedoes. There was no good option. Commander Arleigh Burke used the tactic extensively during his command of Destroyer Squadron 23, the famous Little Beavers, between November 1943 and February 1944. Burke's squadron fought in 11 engagements, used backward torpedo attacks, in 9 of them, sank or damaged 17 Japanese ships. Burke credited the tactic with his squadron's success, said it gave them tactical flexibility that conventional attacks didn't. You could charge aggressively, then retreat if necessary. Launch torpedoes during the retreat. Keep the enemy off balance. Never commit to a position you couldn't escape from. The tactic wasn't universally adopted. Some destroyer captains preferred traditional, broadside attacks, felt the backward launch was too cautious, too defensive. Real aggression meant charging in and slugging it out. Evans argued that aggression without survival was pointless. The goal wasn't to die bravely. The goal was to sink enemy ships and live to fight again. Backward torpedo attacks accomplished both. The debate played out in officer clubs and wardrooms across the Pacific. Traditional officers called the tactic cowardly. Younger officers pointed to the results. Lower casualties, higher kill rates. The statistics settled the argument. By mid-1943, destroyers using backward torpedo attacks had survival rates 40% higher than those using conventional tactics. Kill rates were 35% higher. The numbers were undeniable. The Navy made backward torpedo attacks standard doctrine. In August 1943, published a training manual explaining the technique, required all new destroyer crews to practice it. The manual emphasized that the maneuver wasn't retreat, it was tactical deception, making the enemy think you're retreating while actually attacking. The Japanese tried to develop counter-tactics. They trained their crews to spot torpedo wakes during pursuit, installed better lookout positions with night optics, ordered captains to maneuver unpredictably when pursuing enemy destroyers. These measures helped somewhat. Japanese losses from backward torpedo attacks declined slightly in late 1943, but the tactic remained effective. The fundamental problem for the Japanese was that spotting torpedoes at night was extremely difficult. Even with good optics, torpedo wakes were almost invisible in darkness. By the time lookouts saw wakes, the torpedoes were 500 yards away. Too close to evade effectively. The only reliable counter was to not pursue fleeing destroyers, but that meant letting American ships escape, giving them tactical initiative. The Japanese were trapped between bad options. Commander Ernest Evans continued using the backward torpedo attack throughout 1943, participated in 6 more engagements, sank 3 Japanese destroyers, damaged 4 cruisers. His squadron never lost a ship during any engagement where they used the tactic. Evans's success made him a sought-after instructor. He spent 3 months in 1944 teaching destroyer tactics at the Naval War College, gave lectures on the backward torpedo attack, emphasized that the key was timing, launch too early and torpedoes run out of fuel before reaching the target, too late and the enemy is too close to evade after detecting launch. The optimal range was 5,000 to 6,000 yards. That gave torpedoes time to arm and run while keeping the destroyer beyond effective gun range. Evans also emphasized that the retreat had to look convincing. If you just turned around slowly, the enemy wouldn't pursue. You had to charge aggressively first, make them think you're committing to close combat, then turn suddenly and retreat at maximum speed. That sudden reversal triggered the enemy's pursuit instinct. Made them think you'd lost nerve, one student asked Evans if he ever felt guilty about deceiving the enemy. Evans said no. War was about winning, not fighting fair. The Japanese used deception constantly. Fake radio traffic, false courses, bait ships. Americans needed to be equally creative. The backward torpedo attack was creative, deception that saved American lives. The tactic influenced destroyer design. The Fletcher class had been designed for broadside torpedo attacks. The torpedo mounts could train 75 degrees aft, but that was considered secondary. The primary firing arc was supposed to be perpendicular, but after backward torpedo attacks proved successful, the Navy redesigned the next destroyer class. The Allen M. Sumner class, commissioned starting in 1944, had improved torpedo directors with better aft firing solutions. The mounts could train 85 degrees aft, almost directly backward. This made backward launches easier and more accurate. By 1944, backward torpedo attacks had become routine. American destroyer crews practiced them regularly. The maneuver was part of standard training. New destroyer captains learned it before deploying. The impact on Japanese naval operations was substantial. Japanese destroyers became reluctant to pursue American ships. That reluctance reduced their effectiveness in surface combat. American destroyers could control the tempo of engagements, attack when advantageous, withdraw when not. The Japanese couldn't force decisive battles. In the Battle of Empress, Augusta Bay in November 1943, American destroyers used backward torpedo attacks to devastating effect. Commander Burke's squadron faced 4 Japanese cruisers and 8 destroyers. Burke charged aggressively, then retreated, launched 45 torpedoes backward. The Japanese pursued directly. Into the torpedo spread. 2 cruisers were hit. 1 sank, 3 destroyers were damaged. Burke's squadron escaped without loss. The Japanese commander was criticized for falling into an obvious trap. But what choice did he have? If he didn't pursue, the American destroyers would escape and attack later. If he did pursue, he might hit torpedoes. The backward torpedo attack created a tactical dilemma with no good solution. The Japanese tried using their own destroyers to launch torpedoes while retreating, but their torpedo mounts had limited traverse, could only train 45 degrees. Aft, not enough to fire directly backward. They'd have to turn partially, broadside, which defeated the purpose of the maneuver. Japanese naval architects started designing new torpedo mounts with greater traverse. But by the time those designs reached production, Japan was losing the war. Few new destroyers were built. Commander Ernest Evans was promoted to captain in early 1944. Given command of the destroyer escort Johnston, he continued using aggressive tactics, including backward torpedo attacks. In October 1944, during the Battle off Sama, Evans commanded Johnston in a desperate defense against a Japanese battleship force. He charged a battleship, fired torpedoes, then retreated while launching more torpedoes backward. The battleship Congo took 2 hits, slowed, turned away. Evans's attack helped disrupt the Japanese assault, but Johnston took heavy damage from other ships. Eventually sank. Evans went down with his ship. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation mentioned his aggressive attacks against superior forces, didn't specifically mention backward torpedo attacks, but the tactic was implicit in his fighting style. Charge when possible, retreat when necessary, attack constantly. The backward torpedo attack remained in U.S. Navy doctrine after World War II. Called War Destroyer crews practiced it. The maneuver was still taught at the Naval Academy and Surface Warfare Officer School through the 1980s. Modern destroyers with guided missiles don't need the tactic. Missiles can be fired in any direction, but the principle remains relevant. Tactical deception, using apparent retreat to bait pursuit, turning defense into offense. These concepts still apply. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, who'd used the tactic at Tassafaronga, wrote a paper on destroyer tactics in 1947. He argued that Evans' backward torpedo attack represented a fundamental shift in naval thinking. Traditional doctrine emphasized holding positions, standing and fighting, showing aggression through commitment. Evans showed that mobility was more important than position, that attacking while retreating was more effective than attacking while advancing. That deception was force multiplier. Moosbrugger credited the tactic with changing how the Navy thought about surface combat. Commander Arleigh Burke, who'd used the tactic extensively with his Little Beavers squadron, became chief of naval operations in 1955. He ensured that backward torpedo attacks remained in destroyer training curricula. Burke wrote that the tactic embodied the spirit he wanted in Navy officers: aggressive when necessary, adaptive when required, always thinking creatively about how to win. In 1962, the Naval War College conducted a historical study of World War II destroyer tactics. The study analyzed every major surface engagement in the Pacific, found that backward torpedo attacks were used in 23 engagements. American destroyers sank or damaged 47 Japanese ships using the tactic. Lost only 3 destroyers in those engagements. The kill-to-loss ratio was 15-1. Conventional torpedo attacks had a ratio of 3-1. The CAS study concluded that Evans' innovation saved dozens of American ships and hundreds of lives. The Japanese perspective on the tactic emerged after the war. Interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers revealed deep frustration with American destroyer tactics. Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded destroyers throughout the war, said the backward torpedo attack was the most difficult American tactic to counter. You couldn't tell when they'd fired, couldn't predict torpedo trajectories, couldn't force them into decisive engagements. They controlled the battle tempo. Hara said Japanese destroyer captains became paranoid about pursuing American ships. Every retreat looked like a trap. That paranoia made Japanese destroyers less effective. They hesitated when they should have pressed, broke off when they should have pursued. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Captain Katsuo Uchi, who survived several encounters with American destroyers using backward torpedo attacks, wrote in his memoir that the tactic represented American naval innovation at its best. Americans weren't bound by tradition, weren't constrained by notions of proper tactics. If something worked, they used it. If doctrine failed, they changed it. That flexibility gave them tactical superiority. The comparison between Evans' backward torpedo attack and other wartime innovations reveals common patterns. McKenna's piano wire tensioner, Kowalski's bent rifle sight, Sullivan's empty gun deception, Carter's rhythmic firing, and Evans' backward torpedoes all shared characteristics. They emerged from necessity, used existing equipment in unexpected ways, violated doctrine to achieve better results, exploited enemy expectations, worked because the innovators understood their weapons and enemies deeply. These innovations spread informally at first, combat veteran to trainee, never through official channels initially. Only after proving effectiveness did they become doctrine. The pattern suggests that military innovation comes from field experience more than staff planning. Modern naval doctrine recognizes this. The Navy encourages tactical experimentation. Surface warfare officers are taught to question assumptions, test new approaches, adapt to circumstances. The goal isn't rigid adherence to doctrine, it's finding what works. In 2018, the Naval Surface Warfare Center published a manual on destroyer tactics that included a chapter on historical innovations. The chapter featured Evans' backward torpedo attack as an example of adaptive thinking, emphasized that modern officers should emulate Evans' approach, understand your weapons capabilities, study enemy tactics, recognize opportunities that doctrine overlooks. Don't be constrained by traditional approaches. The manual noted that while modern warfare has changed dramatically, the principles Evans demonstrated remain relevant. Deception, maneuver, exploiting enemy expectations. These concepts transcend specific technologies. There is no memorial to Ernest Evans' innovation, no monument to the backward torpedo attack, but the tactic saved hundreds of American lives, changed how destroyers fought, influenced naval doctrine for decades. Evans died at Samar, but his tactical innovation lived on. It's taught at Annapolis, studied at the War College, remembered by every destroyer officer who learns the history of their profession. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through committees or research programs, through officers who see problems and find solutions, through commanders who question doctrine when doctrine fails, through sailors who understand that survival and victory require creativity, through men who turn retreats into ambushes and discover that sometimes the best offense looks like defense. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.